Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Ruth Greenspan Bell. Ruth is a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. She joins us to discuss developing countries and climate change. Ruth, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So before we delve into the specific topic, I want to talk generally about the circumstances. Coming off another hot summer, records in many places of the world. What's the latest on climate change and how rapidly it's happening versus projections about where we might be?
The IPCC has been issuing reports, quite regularly, and they have become more and more vivid, so the IPCC used to use extremely scientific kind of language and tell us, what they learned. Increasingly, they've been using much more plain language and been a little bit more, I would say, clear about their alarm about where we are. So we really are in a point where I would say that we're probably beyond some tipping points because this is kind of new territory. It's not something we've experienced before. The Arctic is essentially gone. We know that changes substantially the weather of the world. And the Atlantic conveyor belt, that huge loop that brings, that is really the reason why Europe is habitable, for example, is slowing down. There are many, many indicators that we're in a serious situation, and we really need to get cracking.
And to be clear, when you talk about tipping points having been reached or passed, that means that you're no longer fixing something, now you're adapting to the change that's already happened.
You are. There's no way I know of that anybody has thought you can put the sea ice back together again, okay? Greenland is melting. So yes, we have to be thinking as intensely and seriously as we possibly can about how humans can survive in this big changed world that we live on.
Another scene-setting question, Ruth, is about the impact of the global pandemic on global cooperation as it relates to climate change. How big of a setback was that?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that as a big setback. I think...
Well, initially you were hearing reports about it was good for the environment because as we were shutting down, there was less negative impact, but that didn't last long.
It did not last long. I think, and I'm sure you're going to get to this in your questions, the bigger setback was 4 years in which the U.S. basically walked back and did not honor any of its commitments and made it hard for the rest of the world to move forward. And I think that has been the biggest setback.
And of course, an early move by the Biden administration was to re-engage on the Paris Agreement, but still playing catch-up.
Yes. Now, with this latest piece of legislation, we are, we're doing something real. I mean, I think the Paris Accord was kind of built on the notion that we're all in this together. We're all going to move forward together. It's terra incognito, so we're kind of feeling our way. But that if we all make an agreement to do this and we build trust with each other, that we can do it by doing it step by step and then increasing our commitment and increasing our ambition, that we can get to the goal line. So, and that required engagement and leadership from this country and some of the other countries that have been important in putting that agreement together. Then that collapsed. And, it raised fundamental questions about whether you can trust the United States to be there when we're needed. And it's not just climate agreements, it's kind of all international agreements. We know that. But this had really substantial consequences.
Which brings us to the advertised topic about the developing world. And what spurred me to ask you to do this interview is an article that you wrote for Environmental Health News. Talk to us about the dilemma that developing nations face as it relates to climate change.
Well, look, we've always known that the developing nations, the issue of exploiting their natural resources is a complex and somewhat fraught issue. And until climate really became a big issue, one of the issues was whether countries as a whole would benefit from these exploitations or whether just elites and people who had Swiss bank accounts would benefit from this. now we're in a situation where the world would like some of these countries to preserve their forests, to do things that are kind of more sympathetic with getting our hands around the greenhouse gas emission challenge. And we have formally made commitments that we would help some of them financially do that. I'm not sure that we've always delivered, and maybe what we've promised isn't adequate to the task. So these countries are faced with this kind of dilemma. Do they exploit their resources and, in the best case, use those monies to advance the good fortunes of their people?
Share the wealth, essentially.
Yes, to build infrastructure, to educate their people, to do the kinds of things you need to do, or do you wait for the rest of the world, especially the developed world, the folks, by the way, who actually are responsible for this mess we're in through excessive use of fossil fuels? Do you wait for them to help you out and bail you out? What I was trying to say in that article is, yes, those are all, in a way, it's been posed as an issue of resources and money. And what I'm trying to say is that I think maybe we're not also considering a third factor here, which is basic survival. And how does one go about surviving in a very damaged and changed world? And when you exploit these resources, necessarily you impact those natural systems in countries. I mean, look at West Virginia, for example, and worst case, tabletop mountain removal, and what that does to water systems, to all the natural systems that are essential for our survival. And that was the issue I was trying to raise.
I grew up in an area of Pennsylvania where strip mining was part of the normal activity. And when I returned to my old hometown, or where I went to high school, the landscape is unrecognizable in some parts.
Yeah.
Literally mountains moved, rearranged.
It is, and those are our water sources. The water for the Washington metropolitan area comes from a mountain in West Virginia, fortunately not one that's being mined right now. I think we kind of tend to take those things for granted and lose track of the important fact that without those natural systems, we're in pretty bad trouble. And the natural systems are what provide us water, for daily use, for agriculture, all the things that are necessary to life.
A question that's very difficult for wealthy developed nations to answer. You raise in your article, you write, the Democratic Republic of Congo had less than a year before the annual climate negotiations in Glasgow, and they signed on a 10-year agreement to protect its rainforests, part of the vast Congo Basin. In shifting to extraction from that commitment, they seem to be saying basically, everyone's doing it, why not us? How do developed countries respond to a third world nation that's trying to make its way, or a developing economy that has these resources sitting there, people want to pay for them? It's a tough question.
Look, I think in the next sentence of that, I point out that it's a little presumptuous of me, living in a highly developed country. I benefit from excessive fossil fuel use.
Yep.
On a daily basis. I use airplanes all the time. I mean, I was trying to be careful when I wrote this, to be clear that all of us in this country are in an awkward position, tut-tutting people in the developing world.
I can tell you what you said. You said it's hard to fault an impoverished country with no historical responsibility for the fast accelerating climate crisis for wading in at this late date to exploit their fossil fuel resources.
Yes, and I understand why it's tempting, and and truthfully, it's us that's pushing demand, and now we're pushing demand because we have made commitments to building fleets of electric vehicles, all of which use nickel and copper and chromium and a lot of stuff that you find that you mine in these countries.
Yeah.
So yes, we bear a big responsibility for this, and it's really hard to fault a country that says, well, look, there's a market out there and we need money to support our population. Why shouldn't we do it?
There's a market, there's jobs, there's profit. But as you raised, the question whether or not that goes to the right places is another issue altogether.
Yes.
But there also are, even though there are short-term gains, there are short-term and long-term negative implications. What are those? What does committing to extraction do to a country in the short term and the long term?
Well, it goes back to the earlier part of this discussion. It breaks the natural environment up, piece by piece. It breaks up how water flows in the society, where the water source is that can go to the populations and to the farmers to make their job work. It chops up a country, and you mentioned growing up in Pennsylvania. I've visited West Virginia any number of times. My husband's from Colorado. We used to go up to Leadville, and I don't know if you've ever been up there where the molybdenum mines are. And,
I have not, yeah. Know of them, but have not.
Yes, it's pretty destroyed.
Yeah.
And we're a very prosperous, country with a lot of resources. But ultimately, humans can't live independent of the natural world, and that's really the point I'm trying to make here.
When we talk about a place like Leadville and other places, what does that say about the track record of the companies who undertake these endeavors? And then, as you put it, I think, do they clean up their messes?
I'll tell you a small anecdote. My father-in-law was the doctor who was the occupational medicine department at the University of Colorado, Denver, and his specialty was black lung. And we used to go up to the mountains with him, and we would always stop in Leadville and visit the plant there. And he and the people he was visiting with would point at the tailings and where the mountains had been taken apart, and said, "We're working on this. Someday this will bloom again." It's been a bunch of decades.
Still waiting for the bloom.
We're still waiting for that.
Yeah. So.
And it's not for want of good intention
or lack of trying, even in some
or lack
cases.
of trying. It's just
hard
a
to
very complex thing when you have taken a mountain apart to put it back together.
Yeah,
again.
geoengineering or something like that. Yeah, it's like science fiction almost.
Yeah.
So you talk about an alternative approach, what you call a tortoise rather than a hare strategy.
Yeah.
Could you flesh that out for us? What would that look like?
Well, it would be thinking about how to preserve life in that country, how to think about making sure that they have the natural resources, the access to water, the ability to grow crops. It's really kind of thinking small, and I think we've, as a people and as a planet, we've been encouraged to sort of think about how we're all interconnected, and if you can't produce X, Y, or Z thing here in your community, you can get it from somewhere else, maybe from China, maybe from who knows where. It may well be that that countries and people now have to really turn to their own resources.
Well, and some of the fragility of those supply chains have been exposed during the pandemic.
We've seen just in the paper today about China and about how because of the drought, that it's impacting their ability to make products that we rely on and to move them within their country too.
If a country were to choose the tortoise approach versus the hare approach, which in this case the hare approach is extraction and exploiting these minerals or other wealthy or valuable items as quickly as possible, would they need help from the outside? And what are the prospects of the wealthy nations stepping up to help shepherd these transitions?
Well, the wealthy nations have made commitments through the UNFCCC and to adaptation, to helping the poorer countries. Is the money they've committed, is it flowing, first of all? And second of all, is it up to the task? That I think the jury is kind of out on that. I think some of these countries have lost faith that that money really will flow and that they will get the relief. I mean, I think that's probably one of the reasons why these countries I discuss in the article have just decided, the heck with it, we're going to go for it.
Yeah. Well, you used the word trust earlier, and this sounds like trust breaking down.
International agreements are built on trust. What we learned during the Trump administration is they're easily destroyed. So you go into them with the commitment that you're going to do your part, I'm going to do my part. You build it slowly. You reaffirm through active action, that you really are committed to it, and that's what makes them work. And without that, the piece of paper is totally worthless.
So where do we go from here? Are there reasons for hope? Are there either international organizations or individual leaders who are championing another way, perhaps the tortoise versus the hare way?
I think a lot of the organizations that are, I don't want to be too bleak, but this is a serious,
You don't want to soft sell it either.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And yes, I do think, the Natural Resources Governance Institute, which previously was set up to help countries think about doing a better job of sharing the wealth, is now rethinking and trying to think about how climate change works into that. They're part of the EITI effort, and a lot of people in good faith are working hard on that. It's not easy choices. A friend of mine who read this article when I sent it to her said, we're kind of asking other countries to do things that we don't seem to have
Make
the
choices
willpower.
we didn't.
Yes.
Yeah, do as we ask, not as we did ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ruth. It is quite a dilemma. Thanks for highlighting it. For those of you interested, the article was published by Environmental Health News, and the title is "The Dilemma of Developing Countries and Climate Change." Our guest has been Ruth Greenspan Bell. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
A pleasure. And if you'd like to know more about Ruth's work or the work of the Environmental Change and Security Program, you could do so by coming to wilsoncenter.org. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.